People whispered, pointed, and sometimes even laughed when she walked by. Emily had gotten used to it, though it still stung every single time. She was a simple woman in her 30s, quiet, soft-spoken, and kind-hearted, but her appearance often overshadowed everything else. The scars on her arms, neck, and part of her cheek were the kind that made people look twice, the kind that carried stories no one wanted to ask about. They weren't tiny, faint lines one could ignore, they were bold reminders of something painful, something most assumed must have been tragic. Some thought it was a car accident, others believed it was a house fire, and a few cruel ones joked that maybe she had made bad choices, and was paying the price. Emily never corrected them. She never explained. She simply lowered her eyes, pulled her sleeves a little lower, and walked on. At the grocery store, children sometimes stared openly, their innocent eyes filled with questions. Parents, embarrassed, tugged them away quickly, whispering apologies but also casting furtive glances themselves. At the park, when she sat on a bench with a book, teenagers sometimes snickered as they walked past, muttering things like freak or burn victim. At the diner where she occasionally treated herself to breakfast on Sundays, she overheard waitresses at the counter murmuring about her, their voices low but not low enough. Emily wasn't deaf to the world. She heard it all. But she chose silence over confrontation, endurance over explanation. What no one saw was that behind those scars was a woman who had once been stronger than steel. They didn't know that the pain etched on her skin was only the surface layer of battles fought far away from home. They didn't know that her scars were not the result of recklessness but of courage, not of clumsiness but of sacrifice. They had no idea that Emily had once worn a uniform, that she had once rushed across dusty battlefields with her medical kit, pulling soldiers out of the line of fire, patching wounds under pressure, holding lives in her trembling but determined hands. But those days felt like a lifetime ago now. She had returned from her service broken, both in body and in spirit. The blast that left her scarred had also taken away pieces of her she could never get back, the laughter she once shared with her unit, the certainty of belonging, the easy way she used to stand tall without worrying about who was looking at her. Back home, she found herself living in a small rented apartment on the edge of town, working part-time at a bookstore where she shelved novels and dusted old classics. She loved books because they didn't stare at her. They didn't judge her. To the characters in those stories, she wasn't a scarred woman, she was just a reader, someone turning pages and seeking comfort in their words. Every morning, Emily followed the same routine. She tied her hair back, put on long sleeves no matter the weather, and walked to the bookstore. On her way, she passed familiar faces. Some neighbors offered polite nods, but most avoided eye contact. A few people whispered after she walked by. Sometimes she heard laughter and knew instinctively it was about her. She had learned to keep her head down, but the truth was, every chuckle, every mutter, every judgment left tiny cuts deeper than her scars. She told herself she didn't care, but at night, when she was alone, she felt the weight of their words pressing on her chest. She remembered the early days after returning home, when she had still hoped people might see her differently. She had gone to a church potluck, wearing a short-sleeved blouse because it was summer. She thought maybe, just maybe, no one would notice if she smiled enough, if she acted normal. Instead, she caught the gasps, the side conversations, the children pointing, the adults pretending not to stare. By the end of the evening, she sat alone at a table, her plate of food untouched. That night, she decided to hide the scars whenever she could. It didn't erase the problem, but it made life a little easier to navigate. Yet, one thing she never hid completely was the tattoo just below her scars on her upper arm. It was simple, unadorned, just a few letters and numbers that most people found meaningless. A stranger once asked if it was a random code or some kind of design gone wrong. Emily just smiled faintly and didn't answer. To her, that tattoo was not decoration, it was a lifeline. It was the marker of her unit, the family she had served with, the group of men and women she had laughed with, cried with, and bled with. Every time she looked at it, she remembered the faces of those who never came home, the ones she couldn't save no matter how hard she tried. It reminded her that her scars had purpose, that they weren't just random misfortunes but the result of standing where she was needed most. Still, that meaning was hers alone. The townspeople didn't know it. To them, the tattoo was just another odd detail about the woman they whispered about. Some thought it was ugly, others thought it clashed with her appearance. One teenager at the park had once shouted, "Hey lady, nice prison ink," while his friends howled with laughter. Emily didn't flinch. She just packed her book away and left quietly. Her life had become a routine of invisibility and endurance. She didn't seek friends. She didn't try to explain herself anymore. She told herself she didn't need anyone to understand, that the people she had served with were the only ones who truly could, and most of them were scattered far away or gone forever. She lived small, stayed quiet, and accepted her isolation as a kind of peace. But deep down, she still longed to be seen. Not for her scars, not for her silence, but for the person she really was. She longed for someone, anyone, to look past the surface and recognize the story etched into her skin. She didn't expect it would ever happen. She believed that part of her life was over, buried under whispers and stares. That belief held true for years, until one ordinary afternoon at a cafe changed everything. On that day, a stranger walked in, noticed her tattoo, and froze. For the first time in a long time, someone didn't see just the scars. They saw the truth behind them. It all started at a small cafe that Emily sometimes visited after work. The bookstore where she worked closed early on weekends, and she often treated herself to a quiet cup of coffee before walking home. The cafe wasn't fancy, just a little corner shop with chipped wooden tables, humming ceiling fans, and the smell of fresh pastries in the air. For Emily, it was one of the few places where she could sit in public without feeling completely alone. She always chose the same seat near the window, where she could look outside and pretend she was just another customer blending in with the crowd. That particular afternoon, however, the atmosphere was different. A group of young people had taken the table beside hers. They were college-age, loud, and full of the kind of careless energy that came with being young and confident. Emily tried not to pay attention, focusing on her cup of coffee and the book she had brought with her, but it was impossible not to notice their laughter. At first, she thought nothing of it, they were just enjoying themselves. But then she realized their laughter was directed at her. One of the girls, with perfectly styled hair and bright red lipstick, leaned in toward her friends and whispered loud enough for Emily to hear, "Look at her arm. Who even gets a tattoo like that? It looks like random numbers. Probably done in some cheap basement." The boy sitting next to her chuckled and added, "Maybe she thought it would distract from those burns. Bad idea, though. It just makes her look even worse." Another girl snickered behind her hand and said, "Imagine going through life like that. I'd never leave the house." Their laughter hit Emily like sharp stones. She froze, staring at her coffee as her cheeks burned with humiliation. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the chair and vanish from their sight. She didn't dare look up. She knew if she did, she would see the mocking eyes, the sneers, the careless cruelty that people thought they had the right to throw at her. Her scars had been a burden for years, but their words cut even deeper because they targeted the one thing she held sacred, the tattoo that reminded her of her past, her unit, and her sacrifice. The tattoo was small, just a series of letters and numbers, nothing artistic or flashy. Most people wouldn't recognize it. But to Emily, it carried the weight of her entire life. It was the emblem of her military unit, the 118th Medical Battalion, the team she had once served with in one of the harshest war zones. Those numbers represented more than just an assignment, they represented brothers and sisters, people she had laughed with in tents under the desert sun, people she had patched up while bullets flew overhead, people who had trusted her with their lives. That tattoo wasn't meaningless ink. It was proof that she belonged to something greater than herself. But no one in the cafe knew that. To them, she was just a scarred woman with a strange tattoo. She had never told anyone in town about her service. When she returned home from deployment years ago, she tried to fit back into civilian life quietly. She didn't attend veterans meetings, didn't share her story with neighbors, didn't hang medals or certificates on her walls. She kept everything tucked away in a box in her closet, alongside photographs of her unit and letters she could no longer bear to read. People around her never asked, and she never volunteered the truth. It was easier to let them think whatever they wanted. But as she sat there, listening to the cruel laughter of the young group, Emily felt a sting of regret. These strangers thought her tattoo was ugly, meaningless, something to laugh about. If only they knew what it really meant. If only they knew that while they were sipping lattes and gossiping about fashion, she had once been running through chaos, dragging wounded men to safety, ignoring her own pain to save others. She wanted to tell them, to slam her hand on the table and say, "You don't know me. You don't know what I've done." But the words caught in her throat. The years of silence, of keeping her story hidden, had made it too hard to speak. Instead, she sat still, trembling inside, her eyes fixed on the coffee cup in front of her. She thought about the night of the ambush, the explosion that had left her body scarred forever. She thought about the soldiers she had tried to save, the blood on her hands, the screams she still sometimes heard in her dreams. That tattoo on her arm was all she had left of that life, the only visible reminder that her scars had meaning. Yet here she was, listening to strangers tear it apart as if it were some cheap mistake. Her heart ached, but she swallowed the pain as she always did. She reminded herself that these young people didn't know any better. They hadn't seen what she had seen. They hadn't carried dying men on stretchers, praying they would live long enough to make it to safety. They hadn't felt the searing heat of fire against their skin or heard the deafening sound of explosions that changed everything in an instant. They didn't know. And so, they laughed. Still, part of her wished desperately that someone, anyone, would understand. That someone would see the tattoo and recognize it for what it truly was. That someone would look past the scars and see the woman who had worn a uniform, who had carried courage on her shoulders even when fear was eating her alive. She wished for it, but she didn't expect it. After all these years, she had learned that recognition rarely came, and understanding was even rarer. As she sat there, quietly enduring the ridicule, she tightened her sleeve over the tattoo, hiding it from their sight. She didn't want to give them more fuel for their mockery. The laughter still echoed in her ears, and she knew the moment would stay with her long after she left the cafe. She would replay it later that night as she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wishing she could scrub the memory from her mind. What Emily didn't know was that fate had other plans. While she sat there hiding her arm, while the group of young people laughed at her expense, someone else was about to walk through the cafe doors. Someone who would see what they could not. Someone who would recognize the tattoo instantly, not as a meaningless mark but as a symbol of survival, honor, and shared history. In just a few moments, everything she thought she knew about being invisible would begin to change. The laughter at the next table hadn't stopped. Emily sat frozen, her fingers tight around her coffee cup, pretending to read the book in front of her even though the words on the page had blurred beyond recognition. Her face was warm with shame, her heart pounding in her chest as the voices of the young group carried over to her table. She wanted to leave, but she hated the idea of standing up and walking past them, giving them one more chance to smirk at her scars. She stayed still, hoping they would lose interest. The little bell above the cafe door jingled then, signaling a new customer. Emily barely looked up. She didn't care who came in, her whole focus was on making herself invisible. But the newcomer caught the attention of others immediately. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with short cropped hair that gave away his military background even before one noticed the jacket he wore. The patches on his uniform were fresh, his boots worn but polished. He carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a soldier, straight-backed, focused, confident. He ordered a black coffee at the counter, his deep voice steady, then turned to scan the room for a seat. His eyes swept casually across the cafe until they landed on Emily. And then, everything about his demeanor changed. His stride faltered. His expression hardened into something unreadable, and the cup in his hand shook slightly, threatening to spill. Emily, still hunched over her book, didn't notice at first. But the young people mocking her did. One of them chuckled under his breath, "Oh, here comes Captain America," earning another round of laughter from his friends. They had no idea what was about to happen. The soldier, his name was David, took one slow step toward Emily's table, his eyes fixed not on her scars, but on the patch of ink barely visible under the rolled sleeve of her shirt. His breath caught. He blinked hard, as if making sure he wasn't imagining it. The tattoo. Those numbers and letters. That exact configuration. He hadn't seen it in years, but he would never forget it. His chest tightened as memories came flooding back, dust in the air, shouts in the distance, the sharp pain of shrapnel tearing into his leg. And the medic who had leaned over him, calm despite the chaos, her arms moving quickly, wrapping bandages while she ignored her own bleeding wounds. David's heart pounded. Could it be her? The medic everyone thought had died? He remembered the whispers in the months after, the rumors that she hadn't made it out of the blast. Most of them had believed it. He had grieved her silently, along with so many others lost. And now here she was, sitting in a small-town cafe, scars marking her skin, head bowed as if she wanted to disappear. He couldn't stand still. He crossed the room, ignoring the curious stares of other customers, ignoring the stifled giggles of the young group at the next table. He stopped in front of Emily. She looked up slowly, startled by his presence, and for a moment her eyes widened with confusion. She expected the same look she always received, pity, disgust, or polite discomfort. But what she saw in his eyes was something else entirely. Recognition. Respect. Without hesitation, David straightened and brought his hand to his forehead in a crisp salute. The cafe fell silent at the unexpected gesture. The laughter from the young people died instantly. Even the barista behind the counter paused mid-step, watching. "Ma'am," David said, his voice low but filled with emotion, "were you with the 118th Medical Battalion?" Emily's breath caught. No one had ever asked her that since she returned home. She nodded faintly, unsure whether to speak. David's hand dropped slowly, his eyes glistening as memories surged through him. "I knew it," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Then, louder, you were there. You saved my life." Emily blinked, stunned. "What?" she asked softly, her voice shaky. David set his coffee down and leaned closer. "Fallujah. The ambush. I was with the 47th Infantry. We came under heavy fire. I was hit, shrapnel tore through my leg. I was bleeding out. And you," his throat tightened as he struggled to continue. "You ran through the chaos. You didn't even hesitate. You tied the tourniquet, patched me up, kept me conscious until they could pull me out. I never forgot your face. And then, later, we heard you hadn't made it. We thought you were gone." Emily stared at him, her mouth slightly open, her hands trembling in her lap. She remembered that night. She remembered the young soldier screaming in pain, the blood pooling around his leg, the frantic pressure she applied to keep him alive. She remembered the explosion that came moments later, throwing her against a wall, flames licking at her skin, and the darkness that followed. But his face, yes, she could see it now. She had saved him. She had wondered countless times whether he had lived or died, whether her effort had been enough. You made it," she whispered. David's eyes locked with hers, full of gratitude. "Because of you. I wouldn't be here otherwise." For a long moment, silence filled the cafe. The young people who had been mocking Emily sat frozen, their expressions shifting from smug amusement to shock and shame. The customers nearby were wide-eyed, listening intently. Even the barista leaned against the counter, clearly moved. Emily's voice shook. "I didn't think anyone remembered. I thought," she trailed off, struggling with the weight of her own emotions. David reached across the table, his hand hovering as if he wanted to offer comfort but didn't want to intrude. "We remember," he said firmly. "All of us who made it home, we carry you with us. You're a hero, whether you want to believe it or not." Tears stung Emily's eyes. She had spent years hiding, convinced her scars made her unworthy of recognition, convinced that her service had been forgotten. And here was living proof that she hadn't been invisible. She had mattered. She still mattered. The cafe remained hushed. No one dared interrupt. The young people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier cruelty now exposed for what it was. One of the girls looked down at her lap, her face red. The boy who had made the harshest joke about Emily's tattoo bit his lip, ashamed. But Emily wasn't looking at them anymore. She was looking at David, the soldier she had saved, the man who now stood in front of her as a reminder that her pain hadn't been for nothing. For the first time in years, she felt seen not as a scarred woman to be pitied, but as the medic who had once been brave enough to run toward danger when others ran away. And though she could barely find her voice, she whispered the words that had been locked inside her for so long. "I thought I was forgotten." David shook his head firmly. "Never." The cafe, usually filled with clinking cups and soft chatter, felt frozen in time. All eyes were on Emily and the soldier sitting across from her. The young people who had mocked her a few minutes earlier sat stiff in their seats, their laughter long gone, replaced with shame written all over their faces. Even the barista, who had been steaming milk for a cappuccino, let the machine hiss unattended as she leaned forward, captivated by what was unfolding. Emily, who had spent so many years hiding, suddenly felt more exposed than she ever had, but not in the way she was used to. This wasn't the cruel exposure of being laughed at for her scars. This was something different, this was someone pulling back the curtain on who she really was. Her eyes welled with tears she fought to keep from falling. She could barely process what was happening. For years she had carried her story alone, convinced nobody remembered her sacrifice, convinced that her scars were a burden and her tattoo was just another odd mark strangers would never understand. And yet here sat David, alive because of her, looking at her as though she were the most important person in the room. You really remember me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. David leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I could never forget you. That night, when everything was chaos and I thought I was done for, you appeared out of nowhere. You didn't hesitate, not even when you were bleeding yourself. You told me I was going to make it. And because of you, I did." He paused, his jaw tightening as his voice caught. "You were a hero then, and you're a hero now." Emily swallowed hard, but before she could reply, a voice from the group of young people spoke up. It was one of the girls, the one who had first mocked her tattoo. Her voice was shaky, barely audible. We didn't know," she muttered, staring at the floor. David turned sharply, his eyes narrowing at them. "You didn't care to know," he said firmly, his tone cutting. "You saw her scars and made a joke out of them. You saw her tattoo and mocked it because you didn't understand. You sit here laughing at someone who gave more than you could possibly imagine." His words landed like blows. The group shifted uncomfortably, their faces flushed with embarrassment. None of them dared to speak again. Emily wanted to disappear from the attention, but at the same time, she felt something else stirring inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. Validation. Recognition. The truth, spoken aloud in front of witnesses who now knew she was more than a scarred woman to mock. She sat a little straighter in her chair, wiping at the corner of her eye. She looked back at David, her voice soft. I remember you too. I remember the look in your eyes when they carried you away. I prayed you'd survive. David nodded, his throat tight. I did. And when I got home, I told everyone about the medic who saved me. About how brave she was. But then the rumor spread that you hadn't made it. That you died in the blast. I carried that with me for years. His hand clenched into a fist. I wish I had known the truth sooner. I wish I could have thanked you earlier. The cafe was silent except for his voice. Emily felt her chest tighten. She had convinced herself her survival hadn't mattered. That the scars were all she had to show for her sacrifice, and no one cared. But here was proof, living proof, that her actions had changed someone's life forever. She had saved him, and now he was here to save her from the weight of her invisibility. The barista finally stepped forward, her voice unsteady. Ma'am, thank you for your service, she said quietly. The words startled Emily. She wasn't used to hearing them directed at her. She blinked, unsure how to respond. Other customers murmured in agreement. Heads nodded. A man near the door placed his hand over his heart in silent respect. The shift was overwhelming, and for the first time in years, Emily realized that maybe people were capable of seeing beyond the scars. Maybe they just needed to be reminded of the story behind them. David reached across the table, this time resting his hand gently on hers. You don't have to hide anymore. Those scars? They aren't something to be ashamed of. They're proof of what you endured, proof that you stood in the fire and survived. Don't ever let anyone make you feel less for carrying them. Emily's eyes filled again, but this time with a different kind of emotion, not pain, but something close to relief. I spent so long thinking I should stay quiet. That if people knew, they'd just pity me or think I was broken. He shook his head. They'd respect you. The way I do. The way every soldier who served with you would. You're not broken, Emily. You're the strongest person I've ever met. At his words, the group of young people finally stood. One of the boys, the one who had mocked her the harshest, looked at Emily with shame in his eyes. I'm sorry, he muttered before quickly leaving the cafe. The others followed silently, their laughter silenced, their arrogance replaced with regret. Emily watched them go, stunned. For years she had been their target, an easy victim for whispers and ridicule. Now, in just a few minutes, the truth had changed everything. The weight she had carried for so long began to lighten. Not completely, scars, both physical and emotional, never vanished entirely. But now they no longer felt like chains dragging her down. For the first time since she returned home, she allowed herself to breathe deeply without fear of who might be watching. David squeezed her hand gently. You're not alone, he said. Not anymore. You have people who remember, people who care. And if you'll let me, I'd like to make sure you never forget that again. Emily managed a small smile, the kind that had been buried under years of pain. Thank you, she whispered. Around them, the cafe slowly returned to life, though the atmosphere was forever changed. People spoke more softly, their eyes lingering on Emily with respect rather than judgment. The barista offered her another coffee on the house. A man at the far table nodded to her with quiet admiration. For once, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't the woman with scars to pity or mock. She was the medic, the hero, the survivor. And as she sat there across from David, she realized that perhaps the life she thought she had lost wasn't gone after all. It had been waiting, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the moment someone would remind her of who she truly was.